Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Antonio Vecchio and I'm the Community and Consumer Engagement Manager at the Spinal Research Institute based in Melbourne. Welcome to our first part of our four-part webinar series called Your Voice, Your Research, Your Future. And in this part, we want to give an introduction to research and its impact within the SCI community. For those of you not familiar with the Spinal Research Institute, what we are trying to achieve is to build research collaboration and consumer engagement to improve the lives of people living with spinal cord injuries. Before going on, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So as mentioned, this is a four-part webinar series, and in today's session, we really just want to provide an introduction to research and how it works, and how that then flows into the rest of the series. So the next webinar, we look to discuss our role as consumers and how we can impact research, as well as our third webinar, where we get to meet some researchers and they get to share their work. And in the final webinar, we look at a practical approach of how researchers can engage with consumers to engage better outcomes through their work. To keep up to date with the webinar series, there's a link to the website here, but feel free to scan the QR code to keep up to date as well. Just a bit of housekeeping with the technical side of the webinar today. There is a Q&A section just to the side there. Feel free to write your questions and hopefully we can answer them as we go throughout. And there's also technical support. So you'll see down the bottom of the screen a chat function where if you have any technical issues, please feel free to just chat in there and the tech support can help with that. So in today's webinar, what we want to discuss is what is research, how research works. So we'll talk about the research cycle, the impact of research, as well as a brief history of SCI research and the impact that it's had on people like myself living with a spinal cord injury. Throughout today's webinar, I also want you to think about an interactive activity. And the first part of that is, can you think of challenges in your everyday life and maybe just take a moment to think of those, visualize them, write them down if you want, and we'll address this as we go through today's webinar. All right, so we'll keep that in mind. So moving forward, so what is research? It's something that we talk a lot about. And I always think that the best way to explain something is to ask children. So just, we might just watch a little video and then we'll come back to answer this question in more detail.
There's two ways to get research: a book and the computer.
Like, you go on the internet and you learn about it, or you don't have to go on the internet.
Actually, I think there's multiple. Computer.
Researching when you're looking up something that you don't know and how to take care of it and stuff, like a pet.
Book.
I searched on YouTube.
Like I did about my crested gecko.
iPad.
We didn't know what it eats.
Did I already said phone?
Pokemon.
Never put 13 Mentos in a bottle of a pop. And probably he blew up the Mentos and the pop bottle. And if you did do that, but in a cup facing down, it it'd be like a rocket ship, and I think it'd actually make it up to space.
We do research.
So as I said, kids always provide an interesting perspective. And on a serious note, research is something that many of us talk about. And over the last period of time throughout the pandemic, research has probably been thrust into the spotlight and discussed. And I know, having conversations that in my own experience as a consumer of and living with a spinal cord injury, that research is something we talk about, but not necessarily how research works. And if anything, the findings of research is discussed more than anything. So I guess a way of defining research is that research is a systemic investigation to increase knowledge. And to really emphasize, and something that we're going to talk about a lot today, is the word systemic, that there is a process to research to create outcomes. Research involves identifying a hypothesis to be investigated, collecting and analyzing data, and disseminating the findings. So that sort of elaborates the system in which research generates knowledge a bit more. A great quote that I love, and it really simplifies research, is research is creating new knowledge. And part of that is research can explain why something happens, how something happens. It can confirm or deny something that we know might be true, and really unlocks a lot of information throughout society in the medical and social areas as well. Something that I want you to think about, and we might bring up a poll just on the side there, is that we speak a lot about research, but as individuals, we often aren't sure if research has an impact. So I was just wanting to see or gauge your thoughts on, do you think that research has an impact on your everyday life? So I might just give a moment for you to think about that and answer the poll. All right, thanks for that. So thinking about that in detail, once again, research is something that we speak a lot about. And it's really good. So far, 100% have said yes. So that's a really good indication of understanding how research can impact us. And sometimes we do need to think about that. And the way I think about how research impacts everyday life is looking at different areas. So technology, so the impact that research has had on technology, so even the ability to run webinars like this is a result of research. So somebody's had a problem or somebody's come up with an initiative and they've investigated the idea and then move forward. So areas like smartphones, computers, medical technology. Obviously, something that's been topical over the last 12 months or 2 years, during the pandemic, is medical research. But take that aside, the evolution of medical research, and we'll address some of this in today's webinar, has significantly impacted our everyday quality of life. For people with spinal cord injuries, a combination of technology and medical as well. So things like wheelchairs, the ability for people with spinal cord injuries to use assistive devices and assistive technology has been a combination of the medical and of the technology side. And also another area that sometimes is forgotten around research, and something that I'm really probably a little bit biased towards, is the social side of research. So the research of how society operates and individuals operate within those societies and the impact that has had. And that's probably more of a new age sort of form of research where, traditionally medical research and research into technology and new techniques has probably been the traditional mindset around research. Some examples of research and I guess the impact, and there are many examples, so I'm just picking 4 here, is exploratory research, firstly, and to put that into context within spinal cord injuries, that might be asking what causes spinal cord injuries and secondary complications. So you're seeking an answer within that. You're exploring for causes. Then there's a result of that could be clinical research. So then you're taking that information and you're asking, how do we treat spinal cord injuries and secondary complications? So you're then looking for ways to address what you found in your exploratory research. Then there's social research. So what is the social impact of having a spinal cord injury? The ability to form relationships, the ability to engage in society. So whether that's through access, through discrimination, through employment, through studies. So then that looks at the social impact of having a spinal cord injury. And then the psychological research. So what is the mental impact of living with a spinal cord injury? So research into that area looks at the mental toll of acquiring a spinal injury. And once again, those are just 4 examples, and there are other examples of research, but I've chosen 4 for the purposes of this discussion. So I guess looking at research, and I mentioned before that it's a systemic way of answering a question, is that how does research work? And it starts with a question. So the research then goes into creating a technique to answer that question, gathering information to answer that question, looking at analyzing information collected, and then sharing that information. And this is often called the research cycle. So basically, you go through that process of identifying the research question. Now, oftentimes in this area here, there are ethical considerations as well as funding considerations. And for today's conversation, I probably won't highlight that too much, but they are important parts of this process. So designing the study, or what's called the method, conducting the research and collecting the data, analyzing the data, and then sharing and publicizing the findings. And this really works, and we'll go through this today, in a cycle. And it can be, at times, a continuous cycle, as we'll discuss today. So the first part is developing a research question. So put simply, is a question that the research project sets out to answer. So what is it that we're looking to investigate? It needs to be specific and have a clear hypothesis. So it has to be clear. There can't be vagueness. And importantly, it has to be testable. So we need to be able to test the question and collect data. But also importantly, it has to be fallible. So there has to have the opportunity for the research to actually fail. And through failing, you actually gather more information that may generate further information. So think about the interactive activity. So let's go back to your challenges. Can you convert your challenge into a question? So let's say, for example, you've got, like me, I have a challenge of I probably drink too much coffee during the day. And does that have an impact on me? So just think about if you had to convert your challenges into a question. Okay. So as I said, I have a challenge of drinking too much coffee every day. And if I wanted to turn that into a question, is what is the impact of excessive consumption of coffees on individuals with a spinal cord injury. So looking back at the guidelines of developing a research question, I'm being quite specific. So excessive consumption. So I then would have to define how much is excessive consumption. Is 6 cups too much? Is that 4? So I would have to define that. On individuals with SCI. So I'm really looking at it from a point of view of somebody living with an SCI. And we'll develop this idea as we go through. We spoke before about a method. So essentially this part is, how are we answering the research question? Some examples of method techniques are, it's observational. So we're just purely observing someone, for example, in their natural everyday environment and their natural behaviors and looking at how they respond. Sometimes we look at focus groups and we have conversations and ask them questions. We do interviews or surveys. Sometimes we do interventional research, and that is essentially us introducing something that isn't ordinarily in a group's environment or lifestyle and reacting to that. Sometimes researchers do what's called a meta-analysis or secondary data, and essentially what they're doing there is they're doing a research or a scoping review of research that has been conducted to see if there's any information out there that supports their hypothesis. And oftentimes research can be a mixed method. So for example, they might have might create an intervention and then observe the findings, or sometimes they may do interviews and surveys at the same time. So once again, these are some examples, and not limited to these examples as well. And there are many other examples of methods and techniques in research, but I've chosen these for today's discussion. So example of a method, and we spoke about, is an intervention. Sometimes researchers may create what's called a control group, where they have a set of participants, they introduce an intervention, and they establish their results. So bringing this to my research question, so I would gather some participants with spinal cord injuries, and I would then introduce the intervention, which would be excessive amounts of caffeine, and then gauge the results. So I'm observing for differences, but I would also need to ensure that I have a baseline for my study. So I would need to, I would need to ensure that I take some measurements or some findings initially, and as I introduce, in this case, the excessive coffee, to see what changes that happens. And sometimes it's something that we will speak about in the second webinar, is clinical trials, is that this is what they're doing. They're introducing an intervention. But we also need to know that it is the stimulus that is actually causing the intervention. So for example, let's say group 1 is our coffee group, and group 2, we're not giving coffee. But what we're seeing is the impact that the coffee may have, or the intervention may have, compared to a group that may have no intervention. So we're comparing just to make sure that it is actually the intervention that is causing the results. And that's really important as well. So thinking about your question that you've developed, how would you answer your research question? What method would you use? Would you ask participants? Would you need to create an intervention? So just take some time to think about that. All right. So moving forward, The next stage is a data analysis stage. So you're summarizing the data collected. So you're going through it and you're establishing and you're summarizing that data. Something that you're looking for is, do patterns or relationships exist? Or sometimes what researchers call a correlation. So if this happens, this then happens. And are there any trends in the data? So you're looking for relationships and you're going through the process of seeing if there's any change, seeing if things stay the same as well. Sometimes that can be valuable data as well, that there's no change in the data. This step is important because what you're looking for is, how does the data relate to the research question? And how does this evidence support the hypothesis? So as we mentioned before, in the formation of the research question, you're then looking to test what your question is. And also looking to understand that if the data doesn't support your hypothesis. And that's really important at this stage. And you're essentially gathering the information to see whether it supports or doesn't support your research. Once you have your data and you've written your reports or your theses, the next part is sharing the data. So this is where researchers share their findings and conclusions. So they've gone through the process of asking the question and working out and establishing whether there is evidence that supports or denies their question. They then need to share this information. Information is commonly shared in peer-reviewed journals, government publications, private organizations or reports, or conferences and meetings. So peer-reviewed journals are where researchers share their work and it is reviewed by other researchers and leaders in their field to establish whether the work is credible or not. And that's a really important process to make sure that the research has gone through, the correct processes and the correct ethics, and to make sure that the work is actually worth sharing. Government publications and government reports, even on just government websites, they do many types of research. For example, in Australia, there's the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare that do many surveys. There's the Australian Bureau of Statistics that do things like censuses and run surveys, and they're continuously running different areas of research and making that available. Private organizations also run their own internal research that they share with organizations and share these in reports. And a lot of that culminate in conferences and meetings where researchers get together and share their work verbally. So we've gone through the research cycle. So now what? And that's all that we spoke about before about being a continuous cycle, is that, did the research completely answer the research question? Did the findings raise any new questions? And can this be a continuous cycle? Oftentimes research and publications will say things that further evidence is required. So the research or the data may not have completely answered the research question. And that may have raised new questions. So for example, with mine, the data may have found that yes, coffee does increase certain, does have complications with people with spinal cord injuries. But then that may raise more questions like, well, is it the coffee on its own? Is it other inputs as well? And this may be a continuous cycle, that you go through the research cycle and you continuously find new questions to answer. And then moving forward, you then need to address those as well. But this is part of the bigger picture. So the way that I see research is, I see research as this massive jigsaw puzzle where these are the questions that have been answered, And these are the questions that haven't been answered, or the ideas that haven't been answered. And they form part of a bigger picture, that every little bit of information creates this endless puzzle that continuously provides society and researchers with new information that helps society move forward.